Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted these wheelie shooty boys. These are from the Plastic Soldier Company 28mm scale 45mm anti-tank guns box. Obviously these aren't both 45mm guns. The shorter gun is in fact a 76mm infantry gun, which you can also build with that box. I built these models back in the ancient days of 2016, but if you want to see the build video, there's a link in the description and in the card in the upper right corner now. That's enough of that, let's do some painting. I've primed these models using AK Interactive black primer with microfiller, mostly because it was the only black primer I had at the time. It is a good primer, though a little harder to clean up than some others. Once I'd left that to cure for a couple of days, I spray a base coat of Vallejo Model Air Russian green. This goes all over the model. Don't spray it too heavily or you'll obscure details, and I don't know of anybody that wants that. This is of course pretty simple. Both guns are going to be painted exactly the same way, so I'm not going to show a complete painting of each gun. I'll chop and change depending on which footage looks better for each step. That'll be exciting, won't it? Once the base coat is done, I apply a highlight. This is a mix of roughly 5 parts Russian green to 1 part model colour buff. I'm not very precise with my colour mixing, and I do tend to eyeball it a bit, so it's going to be a little bit different each time, if only just slightly. I always like to suggest mixing colours so that they look good to yourself, rather than just blindly following a ratio. At any rate, I spray this highlight from above the model and a little from the sides, particularly on the upper parts of the wheel rims. This is to create a look of both sun shining down from above, but mostly to create a slightly faded look. Now it's time to use the hairy sticks. First, a dry brushing. The mix here is roughly 2 parts Russian green to 1 part buff. As you can see, I'm roughly applying this along the hard edges like the tops and cornery bits on the gun shield, and the hinges. Are they hinges? Let's just call them raised details. I apply this to the operator side of the gun as well, just to add some interest and bring out the details a bit. And I apply it on the upper halves of the wheels. This should make them look a bit more three-dimensional at a distance. It's pretty simple, but I think it's fairly effective. I then added a wash with a fairly heavily diluted Army Painter Strong Tone. The mix was roughly 1 part Strong Tone to 4 parts water, though of course that's not an exact mix. The purpose of this is just to give the entire model a sort of overall dirty look, with the happy side effect of adding a little bit of darkness in the recessed lines and around the raised bits. I apply this pretty thin, and I make sure not to let it pool up anywhere because that would result in tide marks, which is something I don't want. It's now time for chipping. I figured I might try a little experiment with this, and I tried using some aquarium filter sponge. As you can probably see, this stuff is very coarse. I tried to use it exactly the same way as I would use the less coarse foam from old packaging, only I was using tweezers because this is a small job, and my fingers are very fat. Turns out it didn't quite work as I'd wanted it to. It was a bit too subtle. Oh well, I wouldn't have known that if I didn't try it, and I may experiment further with it down the track. Either way, I switched over to the regular foam I use and applied it in the usual method. If you would like further information on this method, there's a link to my chipping video in the description and in the upper right corner now. The colour mix I've used here is roughly 70% model colour black grey and 30% model colour mahogany brown. I wanted some relatively heavy chipping on this. Not too much, but a good amount to show these guns have been dragged across a few battlefields in their time. I think I got a pretty good result. "Tyres aren't green, Herbert, you monstrous dunderhead!" I hear someone shriek. No, they're not. So I painted them using AK Interactive rubber tyres. I've really been enjoying the way this colour looks for rubber and such, so I've been using it a lot since I got it. I try to apply it around the wheel rim as carefully as I can. As much as I wish I could do it perfectly, I can't. It's especially hard under a camera. But fear not, making mistakes is okay and you can recover from them. Just keep moving along doing your best and worry about corrections later. Of course, don't forget to do the outer tready parts and the backs of the tyres too, otherwise they are going to look a tad silly, but not in the fun way. I ended up with fairly neat looking tyres. Not perfect, but good enough at this point. Next, I apply a wash of Army Painter Dark Tone diluted 1 part dark tone to 4 parts water, so fairly heavily diluted. I brushed this onto the tyres and a little bit on the axles. It doesn't darken the tyres down a whole lot, but it does add a tiny bit of variation to the solid colour, which is what I want. As you can see here, it has dried and it doesn't seem to have done a whole lot. It's pretty subtle. That's okay, I like subtle. I did consider dry brushing more of the base colour over the tyres, but I didn't think it really needed it, so I move on. Now for some corrections. I made a mix of roughly 1 part model colour buff to 4 parts Russian green, and I use this as a highlight around the wheel rims. As you can see, I'm using a fine brush for this and I'm going around the rim of the wheel carefully. This is a correction after all. I don't really want to keep correcting and correcting and correcting, so I do try quite hard to keep this off the grey tyre areas. It's not so bad if it gets on the green areas, it'll just look like a scratch or some worn paint or something. Just for a bit of interest, I apply this on some of the other edges of the model, like the hubs of the wheels. That makes a lot of sense. I also apply it around the edges of the gun shield, and a bunch of the other raised details, both on the front of the gun shield and behind it. It's pretty simple, but I think it's effective enough. And that's about all I'm going to do with the acrylics. I did consider painting the gun breeches, but I figure most of the visible parts would be green anyway, and this isn't really the most detailed paint job ever. It doesn't need to be. Anyway, I add a coat of gloss varnish to protect the acrylics, because it's now time for enamels. I won't be doing too much with the enamels, but even a tiny bit can cause damage to the acrylic layers, so I protect with varnish. First, I apply some AK Interactive Paneliner for brown and green camo. I put this mostly in the gaps across the front of the shield. That's a pretty obvious place for things like this. I also apply it on and around some of the raised details on the shield. And on the wheels, both around the hubs and rims. The way I was doing this was by dipping the brush into the bottle, then dipping it in thinner and applying it. Then, if it was a bit heavy or somewhere I didn't want it, I used clean thinner to remove it. Simple stuff really. I apply a bit of this in and around the moving parts too, just to help make that look all greasy and grimy and darken everything down a bit. Next, I add a couple of tiny spots of AK Interactive rust streaks. Surely a gun like this might see the beginnings of some rust while in service. It probably wouldn't be covered in rust, but there might be some visible. I mostly apply this to the hingey things on the gun shield, and I do try to go pretty light with this. Like I said, tiny spots. I've mostly applied this in an attempt to break up the green a bit and add some interest. These are mostly green and that's realistic, but it is a little bit monotonous, and I think the rust makes it look a little bit better. And then I figured why not put some AK Interactive engine grime in the working parts here. Sure, it's not an engine at all, but it's probably going to be just as greasy and grimy in there, so why not? I apply this pretty roughly. I figured that would look better than trying to do it neatly. And I think that might be enough. Adding anything else might be going a little bit over the top, though I did consider adding a bit of dust, but in the end I decided it wasn't really necessary. I apply a coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, and these guns are done. I'm quite happy with how these have turned out. It's a pretty simple paint job, but that's the way these guns were painted. Simply, just green. What more do you need? It makes for a nice and simple painting project. Quick too, which is what I needed. I was going to paint something else for this month, but I'd misplaced the decals because I'm very smart, and I've not been able to get a replacement set so far, so that's fun. At any rate, that was quick and easy to paint up, so hey, you guys get a painting video this month instead of not. I've obviously painted the guns and not the crews that are included in the box. I've also not put the guns on a base. I'm not sure if I'm going to put them on a base or not, after all it's not required for bolt action. As for the crew, those are going to be painted at the same time as the rest of my Soviet infantry figures. That's going to be one of my goals for this year, to finish building and painting my Soviet infantry. That's going to take a while, so don't expect to see that for quite some time. There's going to be a lot of shooty mans to paint. Anyway, these guns are pretty nice models, and I think I've made them look significantly better by applying paint to them. It was quick and easy, though of course I still took my time to paint this and make sure I did things as neatly as I could. There's not much sense in rushing, even if it is a simple job like this. At least for me, I get much better results by taking my time than by rushing. The part where I glued the wheels to the popsicle sticks does look a little bit messy. There is some glue residue there, but that can be cleaned up later. I haven't done that yet because 1, I'm lazy, and 2, I still haven't decided if I'm going to put these on bases or not. I'm pretty sure the shade of Russian green I've used here will enrage some rivet counter who is for some reason convinced the Russians were inclined to use the same perfect shade of green on everything, which just happens to be the same as the green they choose to use. But we don't worry too much about those people around here. You can use whatever shade of green, or tire, that you like, but if you do want to use the same colours that I have, or you are just looking for some suggestions to go off of, there's a list of the colours I've used in the description below. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the comments section. It seems like a good place for that kind of thing. Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, and all of the other things you do on YouTube and social media places. And if you really like the things I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, where you'll be able to see my videos up to 4 days early, or by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of the things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.